Thank you, Mr Chair. I'm very pleased to take a call as we debate this part of the legislation of this bill, dealing, of course, with victims of crime and trying to ensure that they get some justice from the processes of the courts. And this, of course, picks up on some good Labor legislation brought about by the quite notable Tanoa case, where compensation was awarded to a murderer and others. And the government of the time, Mark Burton as the Minister of Justice, as the Minister for Corrections, Phil Goff as the Minister of Justice, was determined to bring through some legislation which ensured that while we met international obligations, while we didn't deny those in prison the right to the justice system, that where compensation was provided, then that should not exclude those who had been the subject of violence, this victim of offences by those who were receiving the compensation now inside prison system. So this bill is about extending the date for a couple of years while the government looks at a replacement, and that's fair enough. But I would like to comment, and my colleague Stuart Nash has touched on this issue, about the difference between the government's approach in respect of this piece of legislation and the treatment it has given to victims of an equally serious, heinous part of our judicial system, and that is the treatment that is given to those who are the subject of sexual abuse. And it's interesting to note that the volume of those who are seeking counselling support for the trauma of sexual abuse was numbering 200 or even 300 a month last year, and then suddenly, with the changes that were introduced by ACC Minister Nick Smith in February, we saw 6 people being awarded compensation for sexual abuse counselling. And I think very much about the organisation in my electorate, Male Survivors of Sexual Abuse, the trust headed by Ken Clearwater, who does an exemplary job, himself a victim of sexual abuse in the past. And the sorts of people that he has coming through his office are those who've often gone into the courts themselves, who've been damaged at an early age and are now perpetrating offences against others as they try to lash out and probably try and find some kind of redress for the abuse that they suffered sometimes many decades before. And the idea that we will not be a just and humane society and provide those people with the only support and assistance that we can provide through counselling, through assistance, and we cut it back from 200 or 300 a month to just a handful is, I think, an indication of the lack of commitment while this government talks the talk about supporting victims, about how actually it really is providing support. And we can only recall Nick Smith's maintaining the pretence that these were new guidelines that had been conceived under the previous Labor government and Massey University, and Massey University then blew the whistle on that and said no, in fact, that those new guidelines were not their initiation. They were devised by ACC, and we had months and months of Nick Smith trying to say that this new pathway that had been developed was perfectly fine and based on evidence, and it actually took until only last week when an ACC manager finally admitted to Mary Wilson on Checkpoint that in fact the changes may have been introduced far too fast for sexual abuse victims, and the numbers very, very much make that very, very clear. I think also of the double bunking that's been introduced under this government, and we know that crime and punishment... Yeah, it will be. It will be. No question about this, and you only need to think of the poor lad in the back of the van in Auckland and what happened to him. And when you start putting violent criminals with others, then it's a recipe for disaster, and the price will be paid very, very quickly. And we know that crime and punishment, we know that it's the scales of justice, and they have to be balanced, and they have to be balanced on an ongoing basis. And when we see what's happening with sexual abuse victims, the balance is certainly not there. And the government, if it's going to do more than pay lip service to victims of crime, it needs to actually acknowledge it's made a ghastly mistake in respect of what's happened with the counselling being cut back so savagely for those victims of sexual abuse, both male and female, and acknowledge that the least we can do as a decent, just and humane society is to continue to provide those people who've been the subject of trauma Sometimes we now begin to celebrate these. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Brendan Burns.
Celebrate some of the people who've come through that kind of abuse. I heard Louise Nicholas on radio this morning, an outstanding New Zealand woman who stood her ground, who brought to the attention of the public some of the abuses that can happen when people aren't called to account. I think a woman that most people would now regard very, very, very highly. And I note also Aaron Gilmore, the dancer, not the politician, who was recently in media again relating his story. So this happens to male and female. Both sexes need access to counselling. We've seen this government talking the talk about victim rights, but when it comes to delivering the services, we see the numbers fall from hundreds to a handful. And that, I think, Mr. Speaker, is an illustration that this government will talk the talk but not walk the walk in respect of delivering for those who are the victims of violence in New Zealand. Labor's record on this is right the way across the board. We introduced the Sentencing Act in 2002 with its presumption in favour of reparation. We introduced the Victims' Rights Act in 2002, which extended a number of rights to victims. We introduced the piece of legislation being amended by the government now in Prisoners' Aid and Victims' Claims Act in 2005. And of course in 2008, Annette King announced the Victims' Charter to be developed to build awareness of the standard of service that victims can expect from government agencies. Those victims include those who are the subject of sexual abuse, and I would like to see the government reinstate the counselling that has been available to those poor people who've been the subject of sexual abuse trauma and who deserve every bit of support that can be mustered by the state. Thank you.